Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to those of you who are joining us from around the world. My name is Aspen, and welcome to today's CPD accredited webinar hosted by the Global Compliance Institute in collaboration with Binder as we take a deeper look at AI and compliance. In today's session, we'll take a practical look at how AI is actually being used across AML, fraud detection, sanction screenings, and surveillance programs. We'll also explore some of the emerging risks and how compliance teams can strike the right balance between innovation and accountability. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers. First, we have Faisal, who brings over 20 years of experience working with financial institutions and executive leadership teams to optimize complex technology and compliance programs. Faisal is currently president of RegTech at Binder, a global business acceptance platform supporting regulated entities across Europe and the Middle East. He works closely with product and innovation teams to develop advanced technologies for financial and non-financial service providers, and he is deeply experienced in global regulatory standards, AML and CTF frameworks, and emerging regulatory technology systems. Faisal is joined today by Aaliyah. Aaliyah is head of compliance and MLRO at Adfin. With over 16 years of experience across startups, high-growth scale-ups, and traditional banking sectors, Aaliyah specializes in guiding tech companies to scale operations swiftly while maintaining rigorous compliance standards. Aaliyah has spent over a decade working in risk and compliance across corporate and foreign banking sectors and has now shifted her trajectory to focus on fintech and regtech to leverage technology for social good. We're pleased and honored to have them both here with us today. I'd also like to quickly note that if you have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to pop those in the chat and we'll have a brief Q&A at the end of the session, time permitting. So with that, Faisal, I'm going to hand things over to you.
Thanks so much, Aspen. Hi, everyone. My name is Faisal. I actually recognize a few of the names here in the participant list, so very nice to meet you all. I see Keshara, I see Ilami, Ismail, Kubra. Very nice to see you all here. Um, I think last time Aliyah and myself actually had the pleasure of discussing other aspects of compliance last year. We got some really great feedback and we remembered it. I think you guys were really great at sort of telling us what you loved, what you'd like to hear more of. And one of the items that you sort of put together and really let us know that you'd like to know more about is AI in compliance. Now, what's really interesting is that at the moment in time when you all provided that suggestion, AI was at a stage that if you look back now is far, far different than it used to be. And this was um, roughly not even a year ago. So I can only tell you and imagine that going forward for another year, how the world is going to be different. Now, the world has been different for all of us individually. I'm almost willing to bet that most of you on your day-to-day experiences, whether it's for personal or professional reasons, do use some amount of artificial intelligence in your technology. So what this session is going to cover is quite a few areas in compliance, more appropriate anti-money laundering and CTF, and how AI has a role in this. Now, if the list is still correct, and I'm fairly certain it is, all of you are AFC practitioners, anti-money laundering practitioners, heads of compliances, analysts, all in the AML CTF domain. So you've probably got the question, or you've probably been asked by your CTO or your chief information officer, or even your sales team, hey, have you looked at AI solutions for your onboarding or your transaction monitoring, your risk assessment, all of these different functions that support your anti-money laundering program. And it's very possible that while you've heard a lot of the sort of tools that are available, what you need is a good understanding about the basics of AI and compliance. So that's the promise. However, what's probably prevented you from really pulling the trigger, adopting a solution in any capacity, whether it's on a small scale, on a large scale, is some of the reservations you've had, probably due to data privacy, model issues, data issues, what tool to use, when's the right time to use it, and probably that's what's held you back from really implementing it at scale for you and for your team. So hopefully this session will cover the last part, because one of the things that you probably have been trying to avoid is a lot of these claims about what AI can do. And unfortunately, a huge number of compliance officers fall into this trap where when they try to implement some type of AI solution, it completely falls flat on its face. And in fact, it does more damage than good. So that's the peril. And so on this session, we're going to cover the promise and the peril of AI. In other words, the promise in regards to the opportunity and a couple of things to look out for when you're implementing such solutions or using it from your day-to-day investigations. Okay, that's the deal. Now, this session, the coverage of the session, as well as the topics, are going to be on the beginner to intermediate level, skewing more towards beginner. So if you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to just pause, hit the question button, get into the chat, and we've got Aspen who's moderating it. So and I'll also be taking a look at the Q&A. So if sometimes, and you guys have already done this with Aaliyah and I, if I see some questions are interesting for the whole group, I'm actually going to interrupt our session and we'll just chat about that as well. But if you feel that you want to keep going and you've got questions that you want to ask at the end of the session, we'll have a Q&A session at the end to go ahead and get started with. Okay, so that's the introduction from my side. There is one more thing I'll say before I begin. And this is an interesting project that I just started recently, where AML officers want to actually build their own AML tool. And in fact, there's a lot of different ways to build your own AML tool using very simple and already accessible AI tools. So I'm going to mention this a few times, once now and once at the end. If you want to build or learn how to build your own anti-money laundering tool for anything whatsoever, feel free to drop me an email, faisal@binder.com, and we're going to get you a session started where myself or someone from my team will teach you how to build your own AML tool with the tools that already exist in the market free of charge. And I'm not kidding, it's very, very doable and very, very possible. So I'm very excited. Do let me know, drop me an email, and we'll get you started on that. Okay? So Ali and I are going to go over a couple of the sessions here. We're going to deep dive in some of those items. Feel free to let us know. And with that, I'll get started. So why does this topic matter at this moment in time? Well, if you look at some numbers, and we'll start with the workloads, the amount of transactions you have right now and the amount of customers you have right now has been more than it's ever been. As a population pool, you're now looking at more customers, you're now looking at more transactions, and the complexity that intersects both of this has gone up significantly. By way of numbers, well, the total amount laundered around the world almost 10, 11 years ago has reported, whether or not the data is correct or not, the best data we have is roughly 1.6 trillion. The latest data that we have, as late as 2023, is that number is roughly $3 trillion. And we see that number only rising, not decreasing, because the nature of transactions have gotten a lot more complex, with a lot more monetary instruments, with a lot more usage, and that just is going to increase over time. And yes, another participant in the financial ecosphere will probably be agents as well, not just humans. So the number of transactions and things you have to do has gone up significantly. There's also regulatory signal. So as you can imagine, because of this rising complexity and the increase of money laundering transactions to review, regulators are increasing the amounts of regulatory enforcement, the type of acts, and all the different types of legislations that you'll have to follow, both continentally as well as nationally. And you've probably seen that happen. If you have a Horizon scanner where it's reviewing every type of updates, If you're in Europe, if you're in the GCC, all the different acts and regulations are getting updated very quickly. The regulators are coming out with new pronouncements all the time, and you're just trying to keep up. The next reason why this matters also is acceleration in AI technology. On an individual basis, I am almost 100% sure that most of you, if not all of you, on your personal day-to-day use at least one, if not two, AI-based technology for your day-to-day needs. So this could be you get a text message and you want to be able to answer in the most diplomatic way possible. So you ask your favorite AI tool, what should I answer for this message? It could also be you get a bunch of suggestions, you're not exactly sure what to do, you go ahead and ask your AI tool. But my favorite use case that I've heard from someone talk about is that their favorite activity right now is actually not listening to podcasts. Rather, while they're driving, they'll ask their AI tool to sort of talk about a certain topic, and they're going to have conversations with the AI tool during their car drive. So of course, AI has accelerated in daily use, and there is a large amount of incentive and a huge push to embed it also professionally in your day-to-day work. This also matters now because the number of tools that have come out on the market and the types of innovation that is out right now has significantly increased. So if you look at your anti-money laundering flow, whether that's the onboarding, risk assessment, monitoring, and all other aspects, there's an AI tool for each one of this, and there are tens of different possible solutions that you could choose for each one of these areas as you progress along your AML journey. However, they haven't been in the market long enough, so the trust has not been built yet. And in fact, some of us that have used AI tools going back 5, 6, 7 years in our AML practices have been burned by some pretty negative experiences. So we have a hard time trusting. Compliance officers, we're sort of distrusting by nature. We're always shown deception on a day-to-day basis. So we don't trust a lot of things that come in. We're very, very skeptical. So it's normal to feel very skeptical with AI technology as well. And then the last question you need to ask, and what you're all asking is, how do I use AI correctly with making sure that I trust not only what it's supposed to do, but also what it's giving me back as a result? So these are all the questions and effects happening at the same time right now, and that's why this topic matters at this very moment. Next slide, please. So let's start with some basics. What do we mean by AI in compliance? It's a large topic, and I promise you, it is not a single tool, it is not a single way of looking at things. It actually has a lot of applications. Now, it's very possible that what you are faced with on a day-to-day basis, or what you're probably using most often, is one of these. But the coverage of AI and what you could use actually spans all of these different items. So first is machine learning. What machine learning essentially is algorithms that are learning either autonomously by themselves, or you are providing instructions to have a certain output. I'll give you a quick example. You might have a certain set of transactions on which you have a certain action that you ask it to do. Meaning, if you see transaction A and it has parameters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it should work this way. However, if you also see parameter 6, you should know that the last time I saw parameter 6, I acted in a different way. And that's machine learning, learning from your training. If you see a certain customer risk, and you want to tell your program that, listen, if you see this customer risk from now on, make a decision on whether or not it should fall into one of the areas of risk. That's unsupervised learning. And that's where a machine comes up with suggestions where it could fall in. So that's one area of AI. Next is natural language processing. As the word and the terms sort of says, You're using your natural language, whether that's English, and there are actually a variety of different languages supported now, where you can ask it to do something for you. So rather than providing it just data, you can ask it in your natural language, do this for me. Bring this document, read this text, tell me what I need to do. What is the most important thing here? When you're communicating itself with the program, this has been the most revolutionary breakthrough in the mainstream in terms of AI. I'm not going to name certain brands, but you can imagine that there have been certain tools that have really come to the forefront where you can essentially interact with them on a day-to-day basis. The next pillar of AI is generative AI. And that's when you're asking AI to come up and generate something based on your instructions that you have never seen before. So some of the mainstream applications have been, I'm thinking of a house next to the hill. Can you generate a picture for me? It's sunny, and there are animals walking around. And what AI will do is it'll take all of its different learnings, receive the information you've given, interpret that in its way it sees fit, and then produce for you something that it has never been done and quite unique. But it's not just doesn't just stop at images. It can actually do that in um, music. You can do it now in video, and in fact, you can also do it for data. So that type of generative AI has been really popular as well. The next part of AI is predictive. Now I'm going to use sort of predictive in apostrophe because there's no such thing as predictive. If you could really predict something, then you essentially what you're saying is you can predict human behavior. And I'll be honest with you, if predictive AI existed in compliance or that technology existed, I wouldn't use it in compliance first. I would use it in all of the things to be able to predict what's someone going to say when I say something, right? I'd use it for that type of technology. So the predictive here is more on the side of an analytics, not really on the side of action. So you won't be able to tell whether a certain customer, based on a certain profile, will act a certain way. That you can't really do. But what you can do is once you have the analytics, you can sort of assess or have a good enough approximation of what the risk assessment might be. Or if you are likely to have a lot more triggers in enhanced due diligence, whether this customer might require a lot more support. So that type of prediction is important, but that's the limitation. What you cannot predict is the behavior itself. And then finally is decision support and decision making. So there are a couple of AI technologies here that allow you to understand what to do next. So a customer sent over a proof of address. And what you can do using AI is sort of say, what should I ask next to the customer? Should I ask for a more recent POA? Should I ask for a POA that's of these types of categories? So maybe not a graduation certificate, but maybe a utility bill. And so rather than going and deep dive looking into the POA itself, AI can actually help you understand what you should ask. But at the same time, once you've received it, it'll give you some amount of advice as to what you should do with that piece of information. So for example, it can look at the steps you've taken on onboarding a customer or reviewing a certain customer, and it will tell you advice on saying, based on what you have done so far and the criteria that you have followed, it seems like it's good enough to go ahead and approve this customer. At the same time, if that AI is well implemented with some really robust learnings in the policies of your company, but at the same time of the policies that govern nationally, it'll be able to also give you advice saying, based on what I'm seeing here, it seems like it's good enough to proceed. So that gives you a lot of information and confidence in the decision making you want to take. I'll also tell you this much. The strength in that decision making, or at least the guidance that it gives you, is really a very powerful thing. Because depending on the expertise level that you have or that you're subscribed to, the advice you get on the compliance tooling you have will be that much better. So, for example, if you have an AI decision-making tool that has been ingested with large amounts of real data, decision-making that's very, very precise, and also has a lot of checking and self-checking, and it's not hallucinating, meaning it's not making up its decision tree, it's always going to be able to give you better advice in essentially what you should do next. So that's where decision support and making AI is all part of it. So these are the sort of five main categories I see. And I really wanted to, really wanted to make sure that we talk about this because AI is not just one thing, it's a few different things. And so you need to think about this when you want to go ahead and implement this internally for your professional use. Okay. Now, I'm really excited about this next thing, and Ali is going to cover this with you.
Thanks so much, Faisal. And it's really great that you started off with the different types of AI and what they mean. Because now, when I talk about the promise and where AI really creates value, I think it'll make a lot more sense to our audience. I'm going to walk through the different areas where we can really see that value being added from the use of AI. And when I talk through each of these different types of areas, think about what Faisal said, the different types of AI and how they're being used. But I will talk about it as we're going on. I'm going to start with enhanced monitoring, specifically around transaction. A lot of us are used to those traditional transaction monitoring systems. They are rule-based, so you set a threshold to flag certain specific parameters, and they can be as simple as the value of a transaction being over a certain amount, either holding that transaction or having that transaction be escalated. Now, the problem with these traditional parameters and traditional rule-based systems is that they're static. But criminals are not static. They are testing systems, rules, and the different thresholds, and they're learning from it. As a result, we really need AI that powers the transaction monitoring that we do because it replaces that traditional rule-based monitoring with more behavioral analysis. Now, what the system does when you do adopt behavioral analysis based AI rules is that it learns what normal is, not just by looking at an individual customer based on globally set parameters, but it really looks into what is that specific customer doing? What are the types of transactions they're making? What are the frequency of those transactions? What type of business, if you're having a business customer, do they work in? What are the jurisdictions that they most often move funds to? And then they use that as a specific baseline. So we're not working off a universal threshold. Because if you think about traditional rules, a £9,000 transaction that should be flagged for a customer that has never sent more than £500 would be suspicious. But if you're thinking about a £50,000 cross-border transaction for a large global import-export business, that's actually quite consistent. Rules cannot make that distinction, whereas the use of AI, especially with regards to behavioral analysis, can. And that kind of segues nicely into how AI leads to better risk detection because typologies that financial crime teams are working with are also not static. The way criminals are committing their crimes, the type of networks they're building are constantly changing. And layering schemes are now spanning dozens of accounts and counterparties. They're global, they cross many jurisdictions also. So when you're looking at each transaction at transaction to transaction level, you're missing the specific risk indicators that are actually buried within multiple transactions going through multiple counterparties. You really cannot look at things in isolation. So the best use case for AI here is graph analytics, understanding the networks behind different counterparties, being able to really see those invisible patterns. Compliance analysts, when they get notified of a suspicious transaction, they often just look at transaction A or customer A, often missing that A, B, C, and D are all connected and they're all related. And there could be different risk indicators that are connecting transactions and customers. Simple things like a common telephone number, a residential address, same devices being used simultaneously. And you really cannot see that without the use of AI. That leads to the efficiency gains. The most immediate measurable gain from the use of AI that can actually be reported really nicely to execs is the reduction in time that's spent on alert triage. In traditional AML functions, the majority of an analyst's time, and I know it from my own experience, is spent opening alerts, really just trying to understand why a certain alert was flagged in the first place, and then going through multiple systems to really understand who the customer is and what the purpose of that transaction is. And this is all very much mechanical work, right? It doesn't require too much skills or expertise. Being able to use AI to automate all those mechanical processes so an analyst can then focus on using their judgment is really important. That's really, really where you can see that value gain. Human in the loop, ensuring that when alerts are triaged and then escalated, a human judgment is then used to inform the next decision is really important. But we will get onto that later on during this webinar. The area that I really love using AI in is when it's about reporting and really just improving the context and the narrative of reports that are being submitted because it's such a time-consuming task. I'll use the example of suspicious activity reports that need to be submitted to financial intelligence units. It takes so much time to, number one, be able to understand what are the transactions in question that are suspicious, collating information about the customer, who's involved, the counterparties, and then turning that into a really clear, easy to understand narrative for number one, your money laundering reporting officer or senior compliance officer to then report that externally. Generative AI, which Faisal mentioned earlier, is really useful in this case because it can take structured data from resolved alerts by understanding what the rationale was about that alert, looking at CDD information, your KYC information, putting that all together to then put together a narrative of, who did what, why they did it, what is the specific typology, and when did it occur. And that really does speed up the time it takes to then raise that internal suspicious activity report and then report it externally. So think about using generative AI when it comes to report writing to reduce that administrative burden so that you can then focus on the judgment side of things and whether something should actually be reported or not. And that segues really nicely into stronger customer due diligence because the inherent consistency with customer due diligence, the inherent problem with customer due diligence is consistency. You can have two different analysts working from the same policy and the same procedure, but they might review a customer file very differently and reach a very different risk conclusion. Faisal did mention earlier about risk scoring and risk assessments. And that's where AI can be really powerful because if you use an AI-driven risk scoring engine, you apply the same logic, the same weightings around the same risk categories across your customer book. And that consistency has a lot of operational uses because it's what drives your ongoing monitoring and where you put the resources and the tech to actually mitigate risks where it's higher. Another CDD another value add from AI and from the CDD perspective is when it comes to ownership, particularly if you're subject to sanctions rules where OFAC 50% applies. Being able to really understand the ownership structure behind an entity and indirect exposure can really be sped up by AI. You can't really do that in isolation, just looking at documents and files that a customer submits. But not just that. we need to also think about things like adverse media screening. That's where natural language processing and those large language models really come into play. When you're scanning vast amounts of news and articles in order to identify negative news that's actually relevant to your individual customer, identifying politically exposed persons at the exact same time. So there are multiple data feeds that AI can scan across in order to provide a risk score and risk indicators that you can then review and determine whether that customer should be onboarded or not. And this doesn't just apply at the onboarding stage. It very much can be applied through your ongoing monitoring processes and also trigger events where you might want to relook at the customer file and the customer data that you hold in place. Now that we've talked about all of these five areas, the thread that runs across all of them is that AI is not replacing the compliance judgment, right? It's speeding up the mechanical tasks that take time, areas where you need to go through multiple different databases to get a singular view to then make that judgment. It's very important to have that human in the loop across the entire end-to-end life cycle of your risk management. If we move on now to the next slide, I'm going to talk about some specific use cases, starting off with sanctions. Now, the core challenge when you think about sanction screening is not the detection of sanctioned individual. It's actually discrimination because you want to catch the right person without disrupting hundreds of legitimate customers who might share similar names. A lot of the traditional sanction screening tools, which use name matching, use what is called known as fuzzy matching. I think that's something that you all might have come across when you're working with vendors or you're implementing solutions. But essentially that means how many character changes separate an individual, let's say, who's called John, who spells their name John, versus a John who spells their name Jon. AI can be layered on top of name matching. And what that means is that you can look at a full profile. You can look at data points such as the date of birth, the nationality, country of residence, address details. You can then match that against sanctions lists to really have a clearer detection of an individual who might potentially be a designated individual. And then you're not causing friction to your legitimate customers. Another use case here is the way name matching, which uses AI and transliteration models, can understand how certain names in languages like Arabic, Cyrillic, or Chinese are commonly Romanized. Because oftentimes you are relying on what is in an identification document that's submitted, which could be in a different language, and that needs to be Romanized in order to match it against most sanctions lists. And this really does result in fewer false positive matches, which means there's less noise to work through. And even just beyond the name matching, and I talked about this prior when I was talking about the value adds from AI, it's understanding the ownership and control structure of a business that you might be doing business with. A designated entity may not appear directly on a list. It might be linked to indirectly to an entity that does. And if you think about OFAC's 50% rule, that's really where you need to understand those indirect connections that do span across multiple jurisdictions. And it is something that's very difficult to do if you're doing it manually and in isolation of other data points. I'm going to move on now to the KYC and CDD side of things. I've already talked about it from the perspective of name matching, but let's really get into all the AML use cases that AI can really add value in. What I love AI for is network and peer group analysis. The first starting point is really just understanding what your customer's risk is. So having risk scoring that is driven by models. And then once you have that standard risk scoring model, you can then segment your customers into specific peer groups. Now that doesn't need to just be as high level as what is their risk, whether they're high, medium, or low. You can get more granular and think about the different industries, the different employment types that individual operates in. You can think about the different jurisdictions that they send money to, the types of currencies that they use, and also the payment channels, because we do operate now in a digital age. It's not just cash and fiat currencies. There's now cryptocurrencies and many different channels via which you can make payments. Being able to segment customers in this way and then analyzing their activity based on their peer group is really how you identify that anomalous behavior, something that deviates from what is regular and what is expected, to then trigger an alert to review it. And network analysis can go beyond that. If you think about organized crime, financial crime and all the different predicate offenses under AML, they all happen within a network, and those networks are very organized. So you can think of mule networks, which is the easiest example to think about, where they are essentially designed to be invisible on individual account level. When you onboard a potential mule, when you look at their CDD information, everything appears above board. It's only when you look into the networks and the connections that you can actually identify that a network exists. And again, it comes down to the data points that you're looking at. There could be similar onboarding CDD characteristics. Again, the same address that's being used, email addresses, email domains, telephone numbers. But also, if you look at the transactional side of things, timing correlation of different transactions between different counterparties is really important in order to identify those different mule networks. Because the worst thing is having a mule network hidden inside your customer books that you haven't been able to identify. And let's now look beyond just that. Let's think about the different types of financial crime typologies. I mentioned earlier that when you think about rule-based monitoring, rules are static. And you have the same problem when you try to identify different types of financial crimes. Typologies are not static, and oftentimes the rules that you're using for monitoring different types of transactions don't pick up on the evolving nature of how financial crime typologies are changing. And so it's very important to be able to have that flexibility, being able to identify how things are changing, and that can really only be done through AI. And I'm going to kind of move away from AML and CDD and look at conduct risk, because it's certainly in the UK and across Europe, it's an area that regulators are really honing in on. Conduct risk meaning not just how your employees are acting internally, what your governance is like, but also conduct risk from the perspective of insider dealing and market abuse, for example. Now, traditional lexicon-based surveillance systems that are used to search across different chat channels that employees use to chat and communicate to each other, um, only search for prohibited words and phrases. It's very much like a list you scan against. Certain words would then trigger an alert. But just like criminals, if you're going to be committing some kind of market abuse inside your organization, you're going to know about this. You're going to avoid certain words. You'll use coded language, euphemisms. You might also use out-of-channel communications. And that's where natural language processing based surveillance is really powerful. Faisal mentioned natural language processing when we talked about the different meanings of AI, but essentially it doesn't just rely on lexicons. It can be trained on linguistic patterns. If you put in behavioral and context analysis within it, it can actually understand and learn conversational dynamics, patterns of information asymmetry between different parties, and then identifies communications where those characteristics exist in order to flag them. And that's really cool and very important also from reporting when you do have to make specific reports under market abuse regulations. The immediate practical value there is being able to automate the data extraction, being able to validate returns with large amounts of data, and then automate the submission of those reports, specifically in jurisdictions where common formats are used for that reporting. And I'm going to wrap this up with fraud, but I'm not going to talk about fraud from an identity and verification perspective. I want to talk about using AI for fraud detection from a biometrics angle, because again, like I said, we're in a digital age. So biometrics have fundamentally changed the fraud detection model. Traditional controls that are used for fraud detection are credential based. You have a username, a password, you might be sent an OTP to authenticate in order to gain access to your account. And what I'm really focusing in here now is an organization that is looking to use AI to prevent its customers being victims of fraud as opposed to identifying fraudulent actors. Now, credential theft is a huge thing. It's being industrialized, large scale black markets selling different biometrics of individuals that have been stolen. It can be done through phishing, SIM swapping, social engineering. So, using credentials alone actually proves nothing about whether an account is being accessed by the legitimate account holder. And that's where biometrics can build a continuous authentication loop on top of credential verification. So this is really using vendors and technologies that have device intelligence built into them that can be able to learn from your user's physical interaction with their device. And it can be as detailed as their typing rhythm, the way they hold their device, the touchscreen pressure, the navigation patterns. And using this really does depend on the type of firm you work in and what are the channels that you're providing your customers to then use your products and services. But whilst they use your products and services, you're collecting all of this biometric information so that when a potential fraudster or someone who is suspected of being a victim of fraud logs in with the valid credentials that they have obtained, but then interacts differently, that mismatch triggers additional friction for the customer. And that is good friction. That is essentially where you might want to send out an alert to your customer via an SMS or prompt in order to verify whether it was them making that transaction or not. But essentially, you are creating good friction, and that good friction is being built in by the AI that you're being used. Um, that we leave it there, and I'm going to pass it back on to you, Faisal.
Thank you so much, Shalia. Thanks, everyone. And hey, guys, the chat is now open, so feel free to drop in any questions. I'll try to get on those. But really great meeting a lot of you and seeing where you guys are from. There's folks from Amsterdam, Turkey, Canadians living in Qatar. That's great. St. Kitts and Nevis. Myself, I'm Canadian, but I was born in Nigeria, but I live in Cyprus. So I figure I've got the North Africa, the North American, and the Southeast European covered. So feel free to let us know where you're from. Hi, Ravenna. Welcome from Albania. On my bucket list as well. Tirana is a city I definitely want to travel to. Okay, let's get onto this slide. Now we're going to be covering the peril part. Okay, so the risks and failure modes. Let's start with the first one, super straightforward, bias and discrimination. It's actually been the most historic issue that AI has had. And there's a landmark case that used to happen back in the US, and this is going back at least decades in the past, where, for example, a bank wanted to use AI to be able to understand whether their users would be creditworthy or not. So they ingested a lot of historical data, and they used that historical data to then make determinations on whether or not they can lend their customers money. The issue was that the historical data that they picked up was biased. You see, during the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and even the early 80s, there was a large amount of bias that humans had when they saw folks from certain ethnicities, when they saw data in terms of the earning capacity in a certain zip code or an area code. And so when the AI was put into place, it automatically started biasing against those nationalities, citizenships, zip codes, area codes, addresses, and so on, because previously those addresses didn't have a lot of lending credibility. And so you now had these regions, and in fact, it's paradoxical because a lot of these regions that are now gentrified and actually have a high income potential or declined loans because of the bias that was there. Another bias that used to exist in models and still do sometimes is, for example, senior citizens. Senior citizens have long been targeted for a lot of different elder abuse scams and vectors. And therefore, the model learned that it's essentially going to always categorize someone that's a senior citizen as a high fraud vector. So these sort of things are really, really terrible in AI, and that's something for you to keep track of. So when you're incorporating a new model, think of yourself, does it have any existing bias that I need to take care of, or will it discriminate? Second, opacity. This just means, are you able to get really good information in how this model calculates the what it calculates? So when it's looking at 100 variables, does it tell you, or is the model provider essentially giving you that information saying, hey, look, this actually uses these 100 variables and it goes through this decision-making process? You need to be able to ask that question every time it comes up. Next, over-reliance. Whenever a model is working on something, is it actually going to carry out the whole decision making for you? Is it going to keep you out of the loop? So you've probably heard about the things such as human in the loop, where you want the human to be part of the decision making and the process. There are, I will agree, and I will sort of argue even, that there are certain AML functions. You should keep the human out of it because the human ends up making more mistakes than actually good. So in certain situations, fine. But in other situations, for example, STR generation, reviewing of complex transactions, reviewing of complex customers, you want the human more involved in it because the AI, like I mentioned in the past, still carries a lot of hallucination and you don't want to have over reliance on it. Data quality. This is going to be a problem that every single institution will have. Why? The customer data that you have is never complete. It's always missing information. Sometimes it doesn't have a country, it doesn't have a last name, it might not have an address, it has a partial address, the phone number's not there. It's always going to have data gaps. That's one. But it'll also have really terrible mixes. So for example, you'll have data that comes from your marketing department, but then you'll have it from your account managers. And sometimes these data is not up to date. It has incomplete data and it's mislabeled. So that's one of those big things you want to consider is when you are talking to a AI provider, you can ask them, are you going to be doing a lot of work on data quality management? Are you going to be cleaning it up, structuring it correctly before you add to the model? Or are you just taking the garbage that's there? Because there's the one thing that you've probably heard many times, garbage in, garbage out. So really important on looking for data quality. Second, model drift. This is where what AI is supposed to do does not do so, and it actually degrades its performance over time. Let me give you an example. Say you've got a certain model that's going to highlight any type of high-risk customers that go over a certain category. Now, over time, it stops doing that. And in fact, it goes lower than that category. It could be a variety of reasons. The parameters need to be retuned again. The customer data has gotten dirty. You need to clean it back up again. You probably haven't given it enough validation. Or just basically, the technology has stopped working well, or you haven't updated with the latest AI models. So these things can cause model drift and can have a big impact on the operations. So something to keep in mind. And then the last one, super important, privacy. Now, I'm going to say something here, and I know for a fact it's true. I know a lot of you, more than a few of you, have probably put customer data or customer transaction data into an LLM or an AI chatbot. I'm not going to mention any names of AI companies, but they rhyme with, HackGPT or Gemini or things of these nature. And so you probably have added or asked them to analyze transactions or customer data. You have to understand that when you do that, you are basically releasing confidential data into an unauthorized application that your customer hasn't consented to. So really important that you don't do that voluntarily. But at the same time, if you're getting an AI provider, ask them which is the underlying LLM that is being used. And is that LLM in a closed environment? Is it actually calling home back to the enterprise and essentially taking your data back to their servers, decisioning it, and coming back to you? Really important because if you don't allow that, it's going to be a big problem. Okay, that's where all your privacy gets broken. Next slide, please. So, what are some expectations globally? First, the EU AI Act. This is a very easy thing to do. In fact, my suggestion is what you can actually do is you can take the EU AI Act, and I've done this myself, and I promise to you, it's not a bad thing. Take the EU AI Act that you see, dump it into your favorite AI chatbot, whatever it might be. And whenever you've got an issue or a question, ask it, can you compare versus the EU AI Act and tell me whether this thing that I'm trying to do conflicts with it or not? Now, that AI chatbot is not a substitute for a lawyer, and you should not, but it's still a good first step to understand. Not everything needs to be first pass legal review, but at least gives you an indication on which way you're going before you apply it. Of course, have it checked by a legal expert. Second, in the US, there's been a lot of expectation and guidance on model risk management. In fact, the DOJ and the FDIC released a lot of literature on what should you think about when you have models implemented and how you should think about managing them. So that's really, really straightforward. In Australia, there's been a number of literature on it, and globally as well. FATF has already opined on AI. It's already made the opinion that AI is definitely an accelerator. It hasn't sort of mandated yet nationally for countries to adopt an AI strategy for its AML operations, but it's certainly pushed for a lot of automation, and AI is definitely one of those as well. So these are sort of the regulatory expectation of global trends, means that regulators, both nationally as well as recommendation bodies like FATF, are already talking about it, and it's only a matter of time before you need to start implementing some of those. I'll now hand it back over to Elliot.
Thanks, Faisal, which it leads us really nicely into the ethical considerations that you should all think about. We also had a question pop up around auditability and for people within an audit function, how they can make sure that AI models have been built correctly, are working correctly. So this area is going to be super useful for you because these are the ethical considerations that even an audit function should keep in mind when reviewing the different types of AI models being used internally. Let's start with fairness. The way models are generally trained is they're trained on historical data or they're trained on synthetic data if you're starting from scratch. But essentially, if you're using historical data, the model is inheriting biases that have already been embedded based on actions that have historically been taken. Now, that can lead to discrimination, bad lending decisions, a risk on a customer, for instance, because an account is not opened. And that's really where regulators want firms to have a practical test around how their models are being run. So the best way to do that is to run your model's output across your customer segments and then ask yourself whether any cohort is being treated systematically different without a risk justified reason. Now, if you're doing this in a customer segmentation where the customer segmentation is based on actual risk indicators and a risk rating that has been built out, it's going to be a much easier exercise for you to do. So I recommend that when this test is being performed, you first start off with how you're risk rating your customers and how you're segmenting them based on their individual risk ratings, and then run your model and look at the output across that entire segment, and then really ask that question about whether that output is proportionate to the risk that customer is exposed to. Now, this can be done in a batch fashion, so in a sample testing manner, if you don't have the resources to do this across your entire customer book. But it's very important that this type of testing is built in on a periodic basis, not just by compliance, but also an audit function that can then independently review the tests the compliance function is doing. Now, FATF's AI guidance has flagged the risk that models trained on skewed data may unfairly target certain customer groups. And of course, that leads to financial exclusion. And Faisal talked about, having incomplete data. Now, that has always been the bane of my life as a compliance officer, because oftentimes either that customer data is incomplete or it's out of date, or it's just inaccurate. So it's really important that whatever the data is that feeds the model, it's accurate, it's current, and it's complete. And that's exactly why FATF and other regulatory bodies are focusing on this. Transparency is another ethical consideration. I'm going to talk about the two dimensions of transparency that should be satisfied. Now, the first is technical interpretability. So, can you explain concretely what drove a specific output? The answer is not, oh, the model has assessed the risk factors. Okay. The correct answer should be the model looks at these different variables, and each variable is weighted in this manner to produce this score. Now, AI compliance tools need to really offer sufficient explainability on the output. And that explainability is what's going to be scrutinized by regulators and by auditors and any other law enforcement agency. But also internally, it's something that should be scrutinized by yourselves as well when you're testing the output of the model. And the second transparency angle is plain language explainability. A compliance officer should be able to explain the decision of a model output that can be meaningfully understood and also challenged. So, the consistent expectation of regulators is that automated decisions that affect an individual must be explainable to those individuals. So, you need to think beyond just being able to explain it to the regulators or law enforcement agencies. If you're taking automated decisions based on a customer's access to financial products, you need to be able to explain that to that individual. Um, the next stage is accountability. Whoever is implementing AI within an organization, specifically within the compliance function, is accountable for how that AI is being governed, how that tool is being used, and most importantly, the data governance around what is feeding into that model. The other important aspect is human in the loop, and I've already touched upon this earlier. AI is not a replacement of human judgment. It should be used in a way to reduce mechanical work, be able to scan across wide range of databases to give a coherent picture on risk. It can be used to draft narratives for compliance to review, but it never replaces that final decision, which should be the human who does that. And data needs to be used responsibly. Faisal gave a perfect example of where, off-the-shelf AI, public AI tools are being used to assess customers. And if that product is not at an enterprise level and it hasn't been kind of implemented within your firm and approved, then using that model for compliance reasons where customer data is being fed into it would not be a responsible use of it. Now, whenever you do implement different vendor tools that would use AI, which has customer data being processed through it, it's important that you then add that to your privacy notices, especially within Europe and the UK. GDPR principles apply, but also the data needs to be proportionate to what actually it's being used for. So an excessive amount of data that actually has no value or use to a model should not be fed into that model. Let's move on to the next slide. Before we do that, there was a question on the slide, and it's, should AI be used from a predictive side of things to predict risk? My answer is it should. I think being able to predict risk segments where risk is crystallizing is very important when it comes to risk mitigation, but also the types of management information you want to report upwards. But I'm going to leave it open to you all. Drop what you think within the chat so we can see your views. But let's get into the operational challenges because it's not easy to implement AI. You have to build a use case around it. Yes, there could be the messaging that a firm where you work really wants to adopt AI, but it's not that easy, okay? It's not always off the shelf. There are numerous operational challenges. The first one being legacy systems. Many transaction monitoring and customer screening platforms were built in the early 2000s, okay? They used to run on batch processing, file uploads. They would produce structured alert outputs. There would be no real-time capabilities. And they probably live within your organization on multiple different back-end platforms. That's a real issue when it comes to wanting to implement an AI solution because fragmented data can be a real challenge. because if it's siloed across 12 different legacy systems, they most likely are in incompatible formats. The types of way data is being named in the different systems will be different, and that can be a huge challenge for engineering teams to work with. It also increases the time and the resourcing you need in order to implement AI. So that's a real cost factor that you need to consider when you're building out a use case. You really need to think about your organization and the data framework and the systems that it's currently built with. Another operational challenge is AI literacy. Although we're all using AI in our personal lives, I use it all the time. I love it, especially the way Faisal said, just drafting an email or communication that sounds very neutral toned and professional without any emotion is the best that I love to use it for. But when you're thinking about it from a workplace context, it's really different. And the bottleneck I've seen a lot of firms have is not the technology itself. It's the people. It's the people who are going to be using the technology. It's being able to find compliance analysts who actually understand what it means to have a confidence score on an AI output, for them to be able to understand how a risk scoring model works. What are the different categories within that risk model? How are they weighted and why are they being weighted in such a fashion? Also, you need to do testing, testing against the benchmark you've set, above it and below it, often called above the line, below the line testing. If an analyst doesn't really understand how that's being done, even if it's being done in an automated fashion through a vendor solution you have, that can create a real problem because they're not going to be able to explain the output or explain the rationale behind why a certain decision was made. Vendor opacity, Faisal touched upon it, so I'm just going to kind of skip over that for the interest of time and go through integration, jump onto the integration timelines. Connecting AI outputs to your customer management system through to your ongoing monitoring tools, the transaction monitoring tools you use, and then also having orchestration in a case management fashion to escalate that in an auditable manner to your compliance function is really where the challenge sits. And that takes a lot of time when it comes to integrating because you might have multiple different systems that are integrated through APIs, and those APIs need to have calls where you're running data through them in a two-way fashion. Okay, so decisions are being reflected in each system, and that takes time, but it can also cost a bit. So that cost factor needs to be built in to any use case you have when you're looking to have budget for adopting AI. And then finally, there's a skills gap. Now, I'm not talking about the skills gap from kind of lack of understanding AI. The work that we're talking about really very much sits on the intersection of not just compliance, but data science, data engineering, risk management, and legal. And so a person who can understand all of these areas is really rare to find. So where I've seen firms really doing it right is that they have individuals who can translate what is needed across all the different areas between your data scientists, your product managers, and compliance officers in order to build the solution of what has been envisioned. And so, that's a real important thing to keep in mind when it comes to the skills that are needed internally in order to adopt AI, because that AI needs to be nurtured, overseen, and governed internally. It's not something that you just buy and you integrate and then you leave on the side at the desk or as someone's side at the desk role. I'm going to pass it over to you now, Faisal.
Thank you so much, Aliyah. I'm going to cover these really, really quickly because I think some of you have already gone through this or probably have heard about frameworks before. Um, the one thing I want to sort of really stress on this slide specifically is the training part. So a lot of times, some of you have just been introduced to AI recently. It's never been part of your workflow before. So really important that when you create your framework, you understand how do you train? Do you train about the model, about the tool? Do you train once you've gotten the tool? But you need ongoing training of different AI technologies as they evolve. I mentioned the example that last year, just last year, when we asked all of you, which is the topic that you want to hear more about. You said AI and AML. Okay, now that we're talking about it, since then, the development of it has grown exponentially. So imagine if you're using an AI tool on a day-to-day basis, if you're not keeping up of the changes in that technology that you're using, which is moving at an extremely fast pace, you're going to find yourself in a year where that technology and what you're getting out of it is completely outdated. So really important as part of your framework, you put a lot more focus. I'm not saying the others are not important, but the training part I feel is the most important part of this. Next slide, please. So how do you evaluate AI vendors? Super straightforward. These are easy to do, easy to remember. You don't need a complicated matrix. You all are compliance officers. You also have very good deduction abilities. But these are the things you want to look out for. First, are they talking about how they give you the output that they give you? Are they transparent about the models? Ask them directly the models, tell them to show examples, tell them to identify what those parameters are, and they should be able to give that to you immediately. Second, how do they make sure that the data is transmitted correctly? What are their sanitization? What kind of quality controls do they have with your data, as well as the data that they're going to give you or enrich your customer information with? Third, do they have an independent model validation team? Do they independently test with a third party? Do they do it internally? How often do they test? You need to ask that question. You also will recognize, and you can openly tell them, that there is a large amount of bias that could exist. How do you mitigate that bias so that I'm not getting my previous bias into the data itself? Do you do any pre-processing, any pre-review of the data itself to make sure that bias is there? Do you have a bias index that measures how much bias already is in my data? So that to keep in mind. And then one of the most important parts, number 5, is integration with your existing systems. A lot of you work with with a variety of different variety of different systems. You've got your core banking provider, your AML KYC vendor, you've got your transaction monitoring, your reporting system, your case management, your marketing engine, whatever it might be in your firm. All of these things work together. And so you have to ask them, if you're going to implement AI, are you able to integrate with these systems? Super important. Why? If you implement it on the onboarding, but you don't implement it on the risk assessment, and you're not connected to your case management system, you're just going to get that partial truth, but the AI might need the data from risk assessment and the data from the case management to be able to give you the actual output that will be productive for you. So really important that they integrate with existing systems. The most important system that they probably need to integrate with is your CRM or whichever tool you use for your onboarding, how you accept customers. If they're able to integrate with that, that's at least a good first step. But they need to be strong and robust enough to integrate with all other different existing systems. And then finally, regulatory alignment. Do they have experience with companies in your space that have the same regulator? Have they had customers that have passed through the same regulator and passed audits where their system was part of the tooling? That's a really easy question to ask to tick that regulatory alignment box. What kind of updates do they do on an ongoing basis to make sure that their tool abides by the regulatory requirements you might have? So if you're in country A and it has AML Act X, and that AML Act goes through updates, do they ingest that information to make sure that your model is now up to date? That's a question to ask to make sure you have regulatory alignment. Aaliyah?
Thanks, Faisal. Now let's talk about the practical roadmap. Now that you understand the different use cases of AI, the value adds, the perils, let's talk about how you can go about implementing it. Now, this roadmap is designed to be realistic, and where firms have the most painful AI deployments, it's when they skip through phase 1 and then they go through phase 3. Okay, so let's first start with the foundations. Before any AI model can work, you need clean, current, consistent, and documented data. So that means you need to start with a data quality audit. Understand, where does customer data and where does transaction data currently live in your organization? On which systems? Are they then consistent across all systems for that same customer? Are they correctly and accurately labeled in a fashion that the vendor that you want to integrate with can make successful API calls with the way the data is labeled? You also need to define who owns AI risk within your firm. Draft an acceptable use policy to capture what is the baseline of where AI can be used, where it cannot, and what are the metrics you are going to gather and report to assess the effectiveness of the AI. You can then easily move into phase two. And I recommend starting with low risk automation. Start with processes where AI can assist what humans are doing. So all those mechanical works with the human oversight and human in the loop. The best things to start with is how you risk score your customers, document reviews for reporting, summarizations is a very strong entry point because if the output is wrong, then the cost of correction is not regulatory failure. Phase three is the high value analytics where AI comes in, and that's where AI can meaningfully change your detection capabilities, as we've discussed. So, using machine learning based transaction monitoring, graph analytics for identifying mule networks, and then a dynamic customer risk score. And I'm sure many of you might have heard of this term before, but a dynamic customer risk score is where you are consistently, continuously assessing a customer's risk based on changes to their customer profile and based on their transactional behavior. So it's not a static risk score you assign when they get onboarded and you forget about. Now, by stage three, you should have already had at least 12 to 18 months of operational data from phase two in order to then validate your model performance against the real outputs you're seeing. And that's where you can do the model validation work and actually see if those outputs are proportionate to that customer profile. And then finally, it's that continuous improvement because you can't just leave what has been implemented and get on with things. No, you need to consistently review it, ensure that the operating model is working in accordance to what it was built to do, ensure that there are feedback loops that are built into the model. So making sure that the analyst isn't reviewing an alert and closing it without any rationale attached to it. Because again, models are learning from the inputs and the decisions that are being made. So there needs to be a decision that's being made. In addition to that, if we move on to the next slide, please. Let's talk about what good looks like. Okay, so human in the loop is super important. It's what regulators expect as well, specifically when it comes to those automated decisions that could exclude customers from financial services. Having transparent, explainable models. If you cannot explain the output yourself, there's an issue. There needs to be strong governance and ownership behind the use of AI within compliance, specifically in financial crime and fraud detection, but then also documentation. So, like Faisal says, if you're using a vendor for your AI models, ask them how their models built, how they govern, what governance they have internally in place to ensure the model does not have biases, that the model is not hallucinating, etc. Have good metrics to identify false positives versus true positives to really understand whether the AI models are being effective or not. That leads into faster and accurate reporting, right? You need to be able to have metrics that can be reported to your board level, but then also if a regulator asks to be able to show that you're actually governing the AI use within your firm appropriately and are measuring it against benchmarks and thresholds. And it leads me to the final point where, when you do all of this right, the business is really going to see the benefits of compliance because you're going to help them scale, take on more higher risk customers, go into higher risk jurisdictions, and offer higher risk products. So you'll be seen as a strategic partner, which I think is super important, where compliance is often just the cost center. All right, Faisal, I'm going to hand it over to you for
Thank you
key
so,
takeaways.
so much, Aaliyah. Thank you so much. So some key takeaways. AI is definitely transforming compliance, but like Aaliyah mentioned, you must have strong governance. Now, the promise is definitely real. Things are much faster, things are much swifter. Your thinking cycle is faster, your decision cycle is much faster. You can make a lot of folks in your firm super happy because your onboarding will be faster, your enhanced due diligence will be faster, and so on. So, and it's definitely a lot more accurate because while AI is improving and it has its faults, well, guess what? It doesn't get tired. It's not bothered by what happened in the morning. It doesn't have any of those effects, and you can measure each one of its actions very empirically. But there are some very strong things to look out for. One, if the data has bias, the model will act accordingly. If the data itself, or if the model itself has not been reviewed for any ethical considerations, it's going to act exactly how you designed it. So these are very, very important for you to look at before you implement any AI tool. And finally, yes, your chief information security officer or your CTO or your CIO will be in charge of implementing said tools, but you need to guide the responsible adoption. You have to make sure that that tool is adopted responsibly inside of your customer data and transaction data. Remember the privacy guidelines I talked about. Remember the bias guidelines we referred to. Make sure the information stays inside. The model is well reviewed. The data is clean. It operates like you want it to, and you've had time to test it, like Aaliyah mentioned, for quite a bit of time before you let it do its magic. And then finally, in this question I get quite a bit, is that will an AI replace a compliance officer? And my answer to this is very, very simple. AI is not going to replace a compliance officer, but a compliance officer with AI will replace you. So that's something to remember and keep in mind. I know this personally. One of my first jobs I had was actually doing data entry in a computer company for in the back office. And it was a gentleman who was not versed in computers. He just didn't know how to use a computer. He wasn't good at data entry. And I didn't think of it then, but it's really coming full circle now. I replaced him because he just was not able to use a computer. And yes, a compliance officer with AI will replace a compliance officer that doesn't have mastery of this topic and this subject. So the future is human and AI. And with that, I feel like we have a
Amazing.
lot of questions come in. I hope I've answered quite a few of them. I know we're just over time.
We do, and I think we could probably let's go ahead and just answer the questions that are in the chat, and then we'll
Okay.
quickly share just the discount shared with you all here at the end. So Daisy asks question, should compliance from a conduct perspective be responsible for how AI is used by the business, or only responsible for how it is used within the compliance function?
Oh, I can answer this one. So if you are the first department to adopt AI in your organization, so the other departments have not adopted it yet, everyone will be looking to you and to your department and how you've used it. And essentially, they're going to be asking you advice. They're going to be asking you. And so you might end up being sort of responsible a little bit for how AI is used. However, don't shy away from it. A lot of what we've talked about is important because you can be then not seen as a cost center. In fact, you're increasing efficiency. And what amazing thing for a compliance officer to not only be considered as a compliance officer, but also the resident AI expert. So, yes, technically speaking, what you implement in your compliance function, you'll be responsible for. But organizationally, they'll say, hey, look, compliance implemented this AI tool. Let me ask, etc how they went about deciding that because we want to be able to do it as well. And you become sort of the resident AI expert, which is a great thing to be in.
Amazing. Thank you. And then Kostas asks, I would like to ask, how do you make sure decisions influenced by AI can still be clearly explained and defended later, especially during an audit or regulator review?
Ali, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I'll take this one. So it really comes down to what you've either built internally or you've bought. I love buying through vendors because it's just the quickest way to spin things up and then scale. And essentially the really good tools out there will have an explanation for why a certain alert was triggered, for why a certain kind of customer has been flagged against a specific list. And they have kind of generative AI narratives that can come up. What you do need to be careful for is that the generative AI narrative is not hallucinating, because I have seen some very bad products out there where, especially when it comes to adverse media screening, where it will just kind of hallucinate and make up an entirely different customer. The best way to kind of assess that is during those demos, really insist on a demo, but then not just a demo, you want a sandbox environment. You want to have like an access for at least 14 days, if not more, to really test the product, run it through some examples and scenarios, and see what is the narrative that's being built. But that should be something that comes with a good AI solution that you should look for, that explainability and that narrative.
Wonderful. And then our last question here from Abdet Fiti, excuse me if I pronounced that incorrectly. Hi, Faisal. What level of AI expertise would you advise a compliance officer to acquire? Basic AI knowledge or advanced level, including building of AI and automation tools? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Adifada, very nice to meet you. Great, great question. So here's usually what I do. We're in the era of technology right now. I think acquiring knowledge is great, learning and courses is great, but the best way to know how to do something is to actually do it. So what I've also told everyone towards the chat, and I'm going to drop it again, is my email address. Go ahead and put in the subject line AML coder or AML code, and I'm going to show you how to build your own AML tools using AI. They're the best way to learn how to do something is to actually do it. Why? You'll get on the you will get on the task expertise. You're going to make mistakes, and that's how you're going to learn and get better from it. So my suggestion to anyone out there is grab any AI tool that you want, and then start building something out of it. Make mistakes, and that's how you're going to get better at it. But if you need a little bit of guidance, drop me an email, and I'll show you how to build your own AML tools with AI.
Amazing. Okay. Well, Faisal, Aliyah, thank you so much for an incredibly insightful discussion today. And thank you all so much for your engagement and joining us as well. As we've heard throughout the session, artificial intelligence has the potential to significantly strengthen financial crime detection and compliance capabilities. But deploying these technology effectively requires strong data management and a clear understanding of both the benefits as well as the risks. For compliance professionals, staying informed and continuing to build expertise in this area will be increasingly important as AI becomes more embedded across all of these financial crime programs. So, on behalf of the Global Compliance Institute, we really appreciate you taking the time to attend today's webinar, and the code that you've all been waiting for as a way to say thank you for joining us today is GCI AI 15, and this is an exclusive 15% off discount on all Global Compliance Institute courses for the next 2 weeks starting today. Again, that code is GCI AI 15 and will be shared with you, all attendees that have registered via email. If you're interested in developing your knowledge in areas such as AML, fraud prevention, or sanctions compliance, you can explore the full suite of GCI programs on our website. And please be sure to contact us at info@gci-ccm.org, or feel free to contact Faisal. His email has been shared in the chat. Additionally, if you have any questions about your discount or your certificate of attendance, please be sure to send us an email. And thank you so much for being with us again today, and we hope to see you at a future GCI event. Take care now.
Thanks, everyone.